On a rain-soaked porch high in the Appalachian Mountains, a wounded German shepherd mother lay trembling in the cold, her injured leg dragging through a smear of blood, while two tiny puppies pressed against her belly for the last bit of warmth she could give. The wind carried their weak cries through the dark forest, a sound so thin and desperate it might have been swallowed by the storm entirely if the cabin door had remained shut. But inside that lonely cabin, a retired Navy SEAL named Garrett Hale woke suddenly from a nightmare that had followed him across oceans and deserts and years. And when he opened the door and aimed his flashlight into the screaming darkness, the war inside his mind met a different kind of battle on his porch. Not soldiers, not gunfire, just life, small and broken and shivering, fighting against the cold, with nothing left except the stubborn refusal to die. What Garrett did next would save a mother and her puppies, but it would also begin something far larger and more dangerous than he could have imagined on that terrible night, because the wounded dog on his porch carried a secret on a small metal tag around her neck. And that secret would lead Garrett Hale straight into the heart of a darkness hidden deep in these ancient mountains, a darkness that did not want to be found. Before we begin, tell me this. Where are you watching from today? Write your country in the comments below. And if this story touches your heart before it ends, all I ask is that you hit that subscribe button so we can keep sharing stories like this one together. Late autumn storms in the Appalachian Mountains rarely arrived with any kind of warning, and that night, the ridges outside Asheville, North Carolina, had disappeared beneath a thick curtain of cold rain that swept across the slopes in long gray sheets, bending the tall pines and rattling the skeletal branches of oak trees that clung to the mountainside like old hands gripping stone. While far below in the valley, the scattered lights of Asheville flickered faintly through mist and darkness, as if the rest of the world existed somewhere very far away from the lonely gravel road that climbed toward a single wooden cabin perched halfway up the ridge, its weathered porch facing a forest so deep and so quiet that once night fell, it belonged more to wind and animals than to any living person. The cabin itself stood small but sturdy against the storm, its tin roof shuddering beneath the constant assault of rain, while the faint glow of firelight leaked through the single window beside the front door like a wound in the darkness. And inside that warm square of light sat Garrett Hale, a retired Navy SEAL whose presence filled the room with a quiet intensity, even when he did nothing more than sit beside the cast-iron stove and listen to the weather tearing at the world outside. Garrett was 39 years old, and everything about him still carried the stamp of the military life he had spent 2 decades building and one terrible night destroying. His tall frame leaned forward in the wooden chair beside the fire, the muscles in his broad shoulders holding the disciplined tension of a man whose body had never truly learned to stand down, even after the Navy told him he was finished. His face was angular and stern, the kind of face that had been sharpened rather than softened by time, with steel blue eyes that noticed everything and revealed almost nothing set beneath a short military haircut that he still maintained out of habit rather than regulation. The faint threads of gray in his ash-brown beard had appeared not gradually with age, but suddenly in the months after the mission that ended his career and began his exile. He still wore what had become his daily uniform since retreating to these mountains 2 years earlier, a long-sleeve flannel shirt layered over his old Navy working uniform Type 3 trousers, the AOR2 digital camouflage pattern, faded by years of desert sun and jungle humidity, and now mountain mud, but still unmistakably military, paired with brown leather combat boots that had walked through Afghanistan and Iraq and now the quiet ridgelines of North Carolina, as though some part of Garrett Hale had never accepted that the war was over. Or perhaps more accurately, as though the war had never accepted that Garrett Hale had left. He had come to this ridge 2 years ago, driving a truck loaded with almost nothing up the gravel road until the road ended and the trees began, and he told the few people who asked that he wanted peace and space and fresh air. Dot Harmon, the silver-haired widow who lived half a mile down the slope, had brought soup and cornbread on his first day and asked if he had family coming to join him. Garrett had answered with 3 words, "Just me, ma'am." And Dot had studied his face with the sharp gray eyes of a woman who had buried a husband and raised children alone on this mountain. And she had nodded once without pressing further, because people who lived in the Appalachians understood that some doors were closed for reasons that did not require explanation. The truth was more complicated than peace and fresh air. Garrett had come to this mountain because he could no longer tolerate the sound of other human beings existing near him, not because he hated them, but because every voice reminded him of one voice. Every footstep behind him triggered the same reflex that had once saved his life, and now made ordinary life impossible. The mountains did not erase the memories that played behind his eyes each night when he closed them. But they made the screaming quieter. They gave the ghosts more room to pace. And on nights like this one, when the rain hammered the tin roof so hard it sounded like gravel thrown against metal, and the wind curled down the slope in long, restless gusts that pushed cold air through the seams of the cabin walls, Garrett sometimes sat awake beside the fire and let the memories come. Not fighting them, not inviting them, just allowing them to move through the room like weather, like something natural and inevitable that would pass if he remained still enough. The static crackle of radios in a language he once knew by heart. The heavy thud of boots on sand. The particular silence that fell after gunfire when men counted who was still standing and who was not. And one voice always, one voice speaking the same words from a place Garrett could never reach again, no matter how fast he ran. Not your fault, Garrett. But the voice was wrong. And Garrett knew it was wrong. And that knowledge was the chain around his neck that no amount of mountain air could break. He had just leaned forward to stir the fire when a sound slipped between the cracks of rain and wind. Something small, something fragile, something that did not belong to the storm. A thin scraping noise against the wooden porch boards, slow, weak, followed by a trembling whimper that rose barely above the hiss of rain before fading again into nothing. Garrett's hand stopped mid-reach toward the iron poker, his head lifted, not quickly, not with alarm, but with the precise controlled attention of a man whose nervous system had been trained to categorize every sound within 2 seconds. Threat, not threat. Known, unknown. The difference between those categories had once meant the difference between life and death, and even now, 2 years removed from any battlefield, the machinery still ran without conscious instruction. He remained motionless in the chair for several seconds, listening. The rain hammered on. The wind dragged branches across the porch railing with a scraping sound that could have been anything. Then it came again. Beneath the storm, beneath the wind, like a thread of sound being pulled through layers of noise. Another slow scrape against wood. And then a cry. Not human. Not strong enough to be an animal in good health. A faint, desperate whine that carried the unmistakable tone of a living creature running out of strength. Garrett rose from the chair with the deliberate calm of a man who had learned long ago that panic wasted the seconds that mattered most. He crossed the room in 3 silent steps, his boots making no sound on the floorboards, and took the heavy metal flashlight from its place beside the door. The weight of it felt familiar in his hand, reassuring, not because he expected danger, but because some habits were older than reason. He opened the door. The storm rushed inward with such force that rain sprayed across the floorboards and cold air stung his face. And the sound of the world outside filled the cabin like a living thing trying to push its way in. Garrett stepped onto the narrow porch, his boots creaking against the wet wood, and swept the flashlight beam across the steps and the railing and the dark yard beyond, where the shapes of trees twisted and swayed in the wind like figures trying to break free from the earth. For a moment he saw nothing but rain and shadows, and the restless movement of leaves caught in the gusts. The beam cut left, then right, then down toward the base of the porch steps, and stopped. A dark, soaked form lay curled near the bottom step, half hidden beneath a pile of wind-blown leaves and debris that had collected against the railing. And it might easily have been mistaken for a discarded bundle of wet cloth or a pile of forest litter pushed there by the storm, except that it moved. The movement was small, a slow shifting of weight, a tremor that passed through the shape like a current of electricity fading to nothing. Garrett stepped closer, lowered the beam, and the light revealed a large, female German shepherd lying against the porch boards, with her body curved in a protective arch around 2 tiny puppies pressed against her belly. The dog was soaked through to the skin, her black saddle coat matted flat against ribs that should not have been visible. Her fur clumped with mud and forest debris and something darker near her hindquarters. One rear leg extended at an angle that was immediately obviously wrong, dragging uselessly behind her with blood darkening the wet fur around the joint in a pattern that made Garrett's breath catch because he had seen that kind of wound before. Not on dogs. On men. The narrow, symmetrical crush of metal jaws designed to snap shut with enough force to shatter bone. A steel jaw trap. Someone had set a trap in these mountains, and this dog had stepped into it, and then somehow, with that leg destroyed, she had dragged herself and 2 newborn puppies through the storm and the forest and the darkness until she found this porch, this door, this last chance. Her amber eyes lifted toward Garrett through the rain. And in them he saw something that stopped him more completely than any threat ever had. Not aggression, not the bared teeth of a cornered animal ready to fight. Just exhaustion so deep it had burned through every other response, leaving behind only a single, quiet, desperate question. Are you the one who helps, or are you another one who hurts? The puppies were impossibly small, no more than a few weeks old, their bodies trembling violently as they searched blindly for warmth that was barely there. One was a darker male, already showing the heavy paws and thick bone structure of a working-line shepherd pressing hard against his mother's chest as though trying to burrow inside her. The other was a slightly smaller female with softer tan coloring around her face and paws tucked deep against her mother's belly, her tiny body shaking with a rhythm that matched the rain. Garrett crouched slowly beside them. The rain soaked through his flannel shirt in seconds, cold enough to make his muscles tighten, but he did not move back toward the door. His eyes studied the injured leg carefully in the flashlight beam. The wound was deep, precise, the kind of crushing cut that did not come from rocks or wild animals or any natural hazard of the forest. This was mechanical, deliberate, metal jaws snapping shut on living flesh with the cold efficiency of a device designed to hold or maim. Someone had done this. Not nature, not accident. A person. And then Garrett noticed something else. His fingers reaching slowly toward the dog's neck to check for a pulse brushed against cracked leather. A collar. Old, faded, half-rotted from exposure to weather and neglect. His hand moved along the leather until his fingers found a small metal tag hanging from the buckle. He tilted it toward the flashlight. Most of the engraving had been worn smooth by time and rain and mud, but beneath the grime a few characters remained legible. Not a name, not a phone number, a code, K9-07. Garrett stared at the tag. K9-07. That was not how someone named a pet. That was how someone numbered inventory, how someone tracked units in a system, how someone marked one item among many. Number 7, which meant there had been at least 6 before, and possibly more after. For several seconds, Garrett knelt in the rain beside the wounded dog, and her shivering puppies, the water streaming down his face and soaking through every layer of clothing. And he felt something shift deep in his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in 2 years of silence and isolation on this mountain. The feeling of a door opening inside him that he had nailed shut a long time ago. Because the look in that dog's amber eyes carried a familiarity he recognized from another life, the silent endurance of a creature that had survived longer than anyone expected, that had fought through impossible pain to reach one final door, not because survival was guaranteed, but because the alternative was lying down in the dark and letting the cold take everything. Garrett had seen that look in the eyes of soldiers. He had seen it in his own reflection, and he understood with the quiet certainty that came from years of reading life and death situations in a single glance that this dog had been imprisoned somewhere, chained, numbered, and she had broken free. And she had carried her puppies through a storm that should have killed all 3 of them to reach this porch. He would not send her back into the dark. Without another moment of hesitation, Garrett removed his soaked flannel shirt and wrapped it carefully around the small family, covering the puppies first, then draping the remainder across the mother's trembling shoulders. He slid one arm beneath her chest and another under her injured hindquarters, feeling the sharp edges of her ribs through the wet fur. Feeling how light she was, how little was left of her, and he lifted all 3 animals against his chest and stood. They weighed almost nothing. A mother and 2 babies who should have been heavy with health and warmth and life, and they weighed almost nothing at all. Garrett carried them inside and kicked the door shut against the storm. The sound of the wind dropped immediately, replaced by the soft crackle of the fire and the steady drip of water falling from his clothes onto the wooden floor. He crossed the room and knelt beside the cast iron stove where the heat radiated outward in waves that he could feel against his wet skin, and he laid the 3 dogs onto the old wool blanket he kept folded near the hearth. The warmth reached them almost immediately. Steam began rising from their soaked fur in thin wisps that curled toward the ceiling. The puppies gave weak, uncertain squeaks, their tiny mouths searching for their mother, even as their trembling began slowly to ease. And the German shepherd, the mother who had crawled through a mountain storm to find this door, let out a long, shuddering breath and closed her amber eyes. Not in death. In something that looked for the first time like the faintest beginning of safety. Garrett sat back on his heels and watched them breathe. The fire popped softly beside him. The storm raged on outside, battering the cabin walls, but in here, the only sounds were the crackle of burning wood and the tiny wet noises of two puppies pressing closer to their mother's warmth. He looked again at the metal tag hanging from the ruined collar. K9-07, Inventory, Numbering, System, 7. At least 6 before her. Maybe more. How many dogs were out there right now wearing tags just like this one? How many were still chained in whatever place this mother had escaped from? How many had not been strong enough to break free? Garrett did not know the answers yet. But as he sat beside the fire with the rain hammering the roof above him and the broken little family beginning to warm on the blanket at his knees, he understood with absolute clarity that whatever had brought this dog to his porch was not finished. The tag on her collar was not the end of a story. It was the beginning. And the beginning smelled like blood and rust and metal, and it led somewhere deep in the dark forests of these mountains to a place that someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. The mother dog opened her eyes once more and looked at Garrett. Her gaze held steady on his face, reading him the way wounded creatures read the world, searching for the single piece of information that mattered more than anything else. Safe or not safe? Garrett met her eyes and did not look away, and something passed between them in that moment in the warmth of the fire and the sound of the storm that neither of them had words for, but both of them understood. You made it. You are here, and I am not going to let anything hurt you again. Outside, the storm continued to tear across the Appalachian Ridge, bending trees and flooding trails and driving every living thing into shelter. But inside the small cabin halfway up the mountain, a man who had stopped believing in second chances sat beside a fire with a wounded dog and 2 shivering puppies. And for the first time in 2 years, the silence in his chest felt less like emptiness and more like the quiet moment before something new begins. Morning crept slowly across the Appalachian Ridge after the long, violent storm of the night before, and the forest surrounding Garrett Hale's cabin carried the quiet aftermath that always followed mountain weather when the wind finally withdrew into the valleys and the rain softened into a steady dripping from pine branches and moss-covered rocks, while the distant sky above Asheville remained pale gray beneath a blanket of lingering clouds. The gravel road that climbed toward Garrett's property glistened with wet mud and scattered leaves, creating the kind of cold, damp silence that often made the mountains feel older than the towns below them, as if the land itself had been breathing long before anyone built houses on its slopes, and would continue breathing long after those houses crumbled back into the soil. Inside the small wooden cabin, the fire in the cast iron stove had burned steadily through the night, and Garrett Hale had barely moved from the chair beside it except to add logs or check the fragile lives resting on the blanket near the heat. He had not slept. Sleep was something he had learned to ration years ago during deployments where closing your eyes for too long could mean never opening them again, and even now in civilian life, his body still operated on a schedule that belonged to a war zone rather than a mountain cabin. But last night, the reason for staying awake had nothing to do with old habits. It had everything to do with the 3 animals breathing quietly on the wool blanket beside the stove. Now, as thin morning light slipped through the window and painted pale rectangles across the wooden floor, Garrett knelt beside the German shepherd again with the quiet concentration of a man who understood both injury and survival. His tall, broad-shouldered frame leaned forward while he carefully rinsed dried blood from the dog's wounded hind leg, using warm water and a strip of cloth torn from an old undershirt. His steel blue eyes studied the injury with the same focused attention he had once used to assess battlefield wounds on teammates who could not afford to wait for a medic, because even though Garrett was no veterinarian, he had seen enough trauma in his lifetime to recognize the difference between accident and cruelty. And this wound spoke cruelty in a language that needed no translation. The dog needed a name. Not because naming her would change her condition, but because Garrett understood instinctively that a creature who had fought this hard to survive deserved to be called something other than the number stamped on the metal tag around her neck. He tested the word quietly, the way soldiers sometimes tested radio frequencies before transmitting. Just a sound low and even spoken toward the dog without expectation. Sheba. The German shepherd's ears twitched, not dramatically, not the full alert rotation of a dog recognizing a command, just a small involuntary movement like a memory surfacing briefly before sinking back beneath exhaustion. But it was enough. The name had landed somewhere inside her, and Garrett said it again softer this time, while his hands continued the slow, careful work of cleaning her wound. Sheba. The puppies received their names by the end of that first morning, earned through the small personalities that were already beginning to emerge, now that warmth and milk and safety had replaced the terror of the storm. The larger male, with his heavy paws and thick, dark saddle markings already standing out sharply across his back, had twice attempted to climb over the edge of the blanket toward the stove with the reckless determination of a creature that did not yet understand the concept of boundaries. Garrett caught him the second time and set him back beside his mother with a faint shake of his head. "Ranger," he said. "Because you charge into everything like a boot camp recruit on day one." The smaller female was different. She moved with a cautious awareness that seemed impossible for a puppy only a few weeks old. Watching her brother's adventures from the safety of their mother's side, studying the room with bright eyes before venturing even a single step away from the warmth she knew. When she finally did move, she moved toward Garrett's boots, which sat drying near the stove. And after a long, careful inspection, she settled against them and closed her eyes, as if she had determined through some private evaluation that this particular human was acceptable. Willow Garrett said, watching her curl into the smallest possible shape against his boot, "Because you bend before you break." The process of building trust with Sheba was neither quick nor simple, and Garrett did not expect it to be. He had spent enough time around damaged creatures, both human and animal, to understand that trust could not be installed like a piece of equipment. It had to be grown, and growth required the one thing that most people were worst at providing: patience that asked for nothing in return. He developed a routine during those first hours that was built entirely on distance and consistency. He placed the bowl of warm milk 2 feet from Sheba's head, then retreated to the far corner of the room and sat motionless on the floor with his back against the wall. He did not stare at her, did not reach toward the puppies, did not make any sound except the steady rhythm of his own breathing. And he waited. Sheba watched him for 30 seconds before lowering her muzzle to the milk. Her amber eyes never left his face while she drank, and her body remained coiled with the readiness to snap or lunge if his hands moved too quickly or came too close to the small lives pressed against her belly. But she drank, and when the bowl was empty, she did not growl. She simply watched and waited and tried to determine whether this human was something new or something she had learned to fear long ago. When Garrett changed the bandage on her injured leg that afternoon, moving slowly enough that each motion was visible before it arrived, his fingers touched the fur along her flank, and Sheba's entire body went rigid. Her breathing stopped. Her muscles locked. Her amber eyes fixed on his hand with an intensity that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with memory. The memory of hands that had caused pain. The memory of touch that meant confinement rather than care. Garrett held still. He did not pull away because retreat would teach her that tension made humans disappear, which would make the next approach harder. And he did not push forward because pressure would confirm every terrible lesson she had already learned about what happened when people came close. He simply remained, present, unmoving, his hand resting lightly against her side, while the fire crackled and the seconds stretched out between them like a bridge being built one plank at a time. Sheba exhaled. A long, slow breath that released some fraction of the tension locked in her muscles. Not all of it. Not nearly all. But enough. Enough to allow Garrett's hand to remain where it was. Enough to let the bandage be changed without a fight. It was a small moment. Quiet. Invisible to anyone who might have been watching from outside the window. But it carried a weight that Garrett felt settle somewhere deep in his chest because he recognized what had just happened. A creature that had been given every reason to bite had chosen, however briefly, not to. And that choice, fragile as it was, meant more than any words either of them could have spoken. The quiet routine inside the cabin was broken shortly before noon by the slow crunch of tires on wet gravel outside, followed by a deliberate knock at the door that carried the unhurried confidence of someone who did not need permission to arrive. And when Garrett opened it, he found Dorothy Harmon standing on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool coat with a covered pot balanced against one hip, and a paper-wrapped bundle of cornbread tucked under her arm, her silver hair gathered loosely behind her head, and her lined face carrying the calm steadiness of a woman who had lived on this mountain long enough to understand that neighbors sometimes appeared without invitation because instinct told them something unusual had happened nearby. Dot Harmon was 68 years old and lived alone in a weathered farmhouse surrounded by old apple trees half a mile down the ridge. Time had bent her posture, slightly curving her shoulders forward in the way that decades of physical labor tended to shape a body, but it had not taken away the quiet strength in her hands or the sharp awareness in her gray eyes. Qualities forged by a life that included raising 2 children largely alone, caring for more animals than she could count, and surviving the sudden loss of her husband, a firefighter in Asheville, who had died 14 years ago when a collapsing warehouse roof ended his life during a rescue operation that saved 3 others, but could not save him. Dot had heard the news over the radio while standing in her kitchen with flour on her hands and bread in the oven. She remembered the exact moment because the bread burned while she stood frozen beside the counter, and for 3 years after that day, the smell of baking bread made her physically ill. She told people she had recovered, and in most of the ways that mattered, she had. But the kind of loss that arrives without warning leaves a mark that no amount of time fully erases, and Dot carried hers in the particular way she watched over the people around her, checking in after storms, bringing food when no food was asked for, showing up at doors because something in the air told her that someone nearby needed a human face more than they needed solitude. She stepped inside Garrett's cabin with the easy familiarity of someone who had visited before, and stopped when she saw the blanket near the stove. Her eyes moved quickly across the scene. The German Shepherd, the bandaged leg, the two puppies tucked against their mother's belly, and her expression shifted from curiosity to something quieter and harder, the look of a woman who had spent enough years around animals to read signs that others missed entirely. Dot set the pot on the table without a word and crouched beside Garrett near the stove, her knees protesting the motion, but her attention already locked on the dog. She studied the injured leg for a long moment, then reached slowly toward Sheba's neck and brushed aside the thick fur along the throat. Her fingers found what she was looking for almost immediately. A dark ring of scarred skin that circled the dog's neck like a permanent shadow, hidden beneath the outer coat, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The skin was hardened and discolored, the hair thin or absent entirely along the band, and the pattern was too uniform to be natural, too consistent, too old. Dot's jaw tightened. She looked up at Garrett. This dog was chained for a very long time, Garrett. Not weeks. Months? Maybe longer. This is not neglect. This is imprisonment. Someone kept her on a chain so tight and for so long that the scar grew into the skin. Garrett looked at the collar, then at the scar beneath it, and felt the quiet anger that had been building since last night settle deeper into his bones. The metal tag. K9-07. The trap wound. The chain scar. Each piece of evidence pointed in the same direction toward a deliberate systematic cruelty that had nothing to do with a single bad owner and everything to do with something organized, something larger. Dot stayed for an hour helping Garrett prepare warm broth for Sheba and ensuring the puppies were nursing properly. She spoke little, but what she said carried the practical authority of a woman who had delivered lambs in snowstorms and nursed sick horses through long winter nights. When she left, she paused at the door and looked back at the blanket near the fire. "Whatever happened to that dog," she said quietly, "it did not happen by accident. And wherever she came from, someone is probably looking for her." The words hung in the air after Dot closed the door behind her, settling into the silence of the cabin like stones dropped into still water. Garrett returned to the blanket and sat cross-legged beside Sheba, watching Ranger and Willow nurse, while their mother's amber eyes tracked his every movement with the cautious calculation of an animal slowly, carefully deciding whether to let down another fraction of the wall she had spent her life building. And then Ranger disappeared. It happened in the space between one breath and the next. Garrett had turned toward the stove to check the water heating for Sheba's next bandage change, and when he turned back, the larger puppy was gone. The blanket showed a small disturbed spot where Ranger had been lying, but the puppy himself had vanished with the sudden totality that only very young and very curious animals could achieve. Garrett scanned the cabin. Behind the chair, under the table, near the woodpile, nothing. His eyes went to the back door of the cabin, the one that led to the small storage area and the rear steps down to the yard. The door was ajar, not open, but not latched. The wind from last night's storm had been strong enough to push the old bolt loose, and the gap between the door and the frame was just wide enough for a puppy to squeeze through. His heartbeat accelerated. Not panic. Garrett Hale did not panic. But the controlled urgency that flooded his system was immediate and total, the same neurological response that had once propelled him out of cover under fire, because a 3-week-old puppy alone in the wet forest meant exposure predators and a window of survival that was closing with every second. He moved through the back door and down the steps in 4 strides, his boots sinking into the mud of the yard, his eyes scanning the tree line in rapid sweeps. The forest beyond the cabin clearing was dense and dark, still dripping from last night's rain, and the ground was soft enough that tracks should be visible if he could find them quickly enough. There. Tiny paw prints in the mud leading toward the large pine at the edge of the clearing. And beneath the pine, barely visible against the dark roots, Ranger sat with his oversized paws planted in the dirt, his nose pressed against something half buried in the ground. Garrett reached the puppy in 6 steps and scooped him up with one hand, pressing the small, warm body against his chest. Ranger squirmed and whined, straining back toward whatever he had found in the mud. Garrett looked down. A short length of steel chain lay half buried in the wet earth beside the tree roots, rusted heavy with links thick enough to hold a large animal. It had not been there before the storm. Garrett knew every inch of the ground around his cabin with the territorial precision of a man who surveyed his perimeter out of habit every morning, and this chain was new. Recently placed, recently dropped. He crouched and pulled the chain free from the mud with his free hand. The metal was cold and rough with corrosion, but the rust pattern was surface level. This chain had not been buried for years. It had been here for days at most, perhaps only hours. Someone had been near his cabin during the storm while Garrett was inside with Sheba and the puppies, while the world outside was dark and screaming with wind and rain. Someone had walked close enough to leave this chain near the tree line and then walked away again. Garrett stood slowly holding Ranger against his chest and let his eyes move along the edge of the forest. The trees stood silent and dripping. No movement. No sound except the steady patter of water falling from branches. But the quiet itself felt wrong now. Charged. The kind of quiet that Garrett had learned to distrust in places where silence often meant that someone was watching and waiting for you to lower your guard. He carried Ranger inside, locked the back door, and set the puppy down beside Sheba. Then he sat in the chair near the window and stared at the chain he had placed on the table. Rust and iron and a message that required no words. I know she is here. The afternoon brought a visitor Garrett had not expected. A boy appeared at the edge of the clearing around 2 o'clock, walking up the gravel road with the hesitant posture of someone unsure whether he would be welcome but too curious to turn back. He was thin and tall for his age, with sandy brown hair that fell unevenly across his forehead, and bright green eyes that seemed to absorb details the way a sketchbook absorbed pencil marks. He wore a denim jacket that hung loosely from his narrow shoulders, several sizes too large, the kind of jacket that had clearly been worn by someone bigger before it was handed down, and beneath his left arm he carried a battered drawing pad with a pencil stuck through the spiral binding. Truett Porter was 11 years old. His father had been a search and rescue pilot based out of Asheville, flying helicopter missions into the Appalachian backcountry to find lost hikers and stranded climbers. 2 years ago, during a mission to locate a missing hiker on a ridge east of the Blue Ridge Parkway, the helicopter had gone down in heavy fog. The hiker was never found. Neither was the pilot. Truett's mother had left the mountain within 6 months of the accident, moving to Charlotte for work, and Truett had stayed behind with his grandmother because the boy refused to leave the place where his father had last been alive. Truett did not knock on the cabin door. He simply sat down on the bottom porch step and waited the way children who have learned the weight of grief sometimes learn to wait quietly at the edges of rooms until someone notices them. And what drew Garrett's attention was not the boy himself, but the sound that came from inside the cabin the moment Truett sat down. A sharp, excited yipping from Ranger, followed by the scrabble of tiny paws on wood, and then the thud of a puppy throwing himself against the front door with more enthusiasm than coordination. Garrett opened the door, and Ranger shot past his legs like a small furry projectile, tumbling down the steps and landing in a heap at Truett's feet. The boy caught the puppy instinctively, his thin hands wrapping around the wriggling body with a gentleness that spoke of long practice with fragile things. And then Willow appeared at the top of the steps, moving more slowly than her brother, watching the stranger with careful eyes before descending one step at a time until she reached the boy and placed her chin on his knee. Truett looked up at Garrett with Ranger squirming in his arms and Willow leaning against his leg, and the smile that crossed his face was so sudden and so unguarded that it seemed to surprise even the boy himself. It was the kind of smile that children lose when the world takes something irreplaceable from them, and finding it again on Truett Porter's face, even briefly, was like watching a light turn on in a room that had been dark for a very long time. They sat on the porch for nearly an hour, the boy and the puppies and the retired seal, who said almost nothing but missed nothing. And eventually, as the afternoon light shifted and the shadows of the pines grew longer across the clearing, Truett spoke about something he had seen before the storm. A truck, he said, his voice quiet but precise, the voice of a child who had learned to observe carefully, because observation was the only way he could still feel connected to the world his father had inhabited. A green pickup, moving slowly along the lower trail near the eastern ridge. The part of the forest where the woods dipped into a narrow valley that most people avoided. Truett did not explain why most people avoided it, but the way he paused before continuing told Garrett that the boy was deciding how much to share with a man he had only just met, and the decision mattered to him. There were cages in the back of the truck, Truett said. Small metal cages stacked on top of each other. I could see them when the truck passed the gap in the trees near the old logging road. I drew it. He opened his sketchbook and turned to a page near the middle. The drawing was remarkably detailed for an 11-year-old, the truck rendered with careful attention to its shape and proportions, and in the bed of the truck clearly visible a stack of small wire cages, the kind used to transport animals. Truett had even captured 3 characters from the license plate written in the margin beside the drawing with careful block letters. Garrett studied the sketch in silence. Then he looked at the boy. Then he looked at the forest beyond the clearing, where the eastern ridge fell away toward the valley Truett had described. The cages in the drawing matched the size that would hold a German shepherd. The truck came from the direction where no one wanted to go. And on his table inside the cabin lay a metal tag that read K9-07 and a rusted chain that someone had left near his property in the dark. The pieces were not yet a picture, but they were beginning to gather at the edges of one. Truett left before the light faded, walking back down the gravel road with his sketchbook under his arm, and a backward glance at the cabin where Ranger and Willow watched him go from behind the porch railing. And after the boy disappeared around the bend, Garrett stood alone on the porch and felt the quiet weight of everything he had learned in the last 24 hours settle into his body like cold water filling a vessel. The wounded dog with the inventory tag, the chain left in the dark, the truck with cages, the valley no one visited. Something was hiding in those mountains. Something that numbered dogs like products and set traps like a hunter and moved through the forest at night with the confidence of someone who believed no one was watching. But someone was watching now. The evening settled over the cabin with the heaviness that November carried into the mountains, and Garrett sat beside the stove with Sheba and the puppies arranged on the blanket near the warmth. Ranger had finally exhausted himself and lay sprawled across his mother's front paws. Willow was curled in the space between Sheba's chest and the blanket's edge, small and warm and perfectly still. And Sheba herself lay with her head resting on the floor, her amber eyes open, watching the fire. Garrett leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, just to rest them, just for a moment. The sound came from behind his eyes before it came from the room. Sand, heat, the crackle of a radio transmitting coordinates. Boots on gravel that became boots on dirt, that became boots on dust so fine it hung in the air like fog. A voice on the radio calling his name, then static, then the percussion of an explosion that existed somewhere between his memory and his nervous system, shaking the walls of a room that was not this room and had not existed for 2 years, but was more real in that moment than the cabin or the fire or the mountains outside. Garrett was in the Helmand province, moving through a narrow alley with his team behind him. Point man. Eyes forward. Every shadow evaluated, every rooftop scanned, every doorway checked. The mission was routine. Nothing in war was routine. The IED detonated 3 meters to his left, and the world became dust and noise, and the particular kind of silence that follows an explosion, the silence where your ears stop working and the only sound is your own heartbeat telling you that you are alive, but someone beside you might not be. He turned. His teammate was on the ground. Garrett grabbed the drag handle on the plate carrier and pulled. Heavy. The man was heavy with gear and blood and the weight of things that were failing inside his body. Rounds hit the wall above Garrett's head. Dust and stone fragments. He kept pulling. 15 meters to the corner. 10. 5. He reached the cover point and looked down and saw the face of the man in his arms. The eyes were open. The mouth was moving. Garrett leaned close to hear the words over the ringing in his ears and the chaos erupting on the radio. Not your fault, Garrett. The eyes closed before the dust-off arrived, and Garrett Hale held his teammate in his arms, in the dust and the heat and the noise, and he knew with the certainty that would follow him for the rest of his life that the voice was wrong, that it was his fault, that he had gone back too late and arrived too slow, and the 15 meters between the explosion and the cover point had been 15 meters too many. He woke in the cabin with his hands gripping the arms of the chair so hard that the wood creaked beneath his fingers. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sweat soaked the collar of his shirt. His breathing came in short, sharp bursts that he could not immediately control, and for several terrible seconds, the room around him did not exist. There was only sand and blood, and a voice saying words that were meant to forgive him, but instead became the chain around his soul that he could never break. Then something cold and wet touched his hand. Garrett looked down. Sheba had dragged herself from the blanket across 3 feet of floor to reach his chair. Her injured leg trailed behind her, leaving a faint smear on the wood. And the effort must have caused her pain, but she had done it anyway. Her nose pressed against his knuckles. The contact was simple and absolute. A cold point of reality against his skin that asked nothing and offered everything. A point of contact between his hand and the world outside his head, cold and real and undeniable. Garrett stared at the dog. The dog stared back. Two damaged creatures sitting in the dark beside a dying fire, each carrying scars that no one else could see. He did not know how long they remained like that. Minutes, maybe longer. But eventually his breathing slowed and his hands unclenched and the room came back into focus. The cabin, the stove, the puppies sleeping on the blanket, the mountains outside silent and indifferent and old, and the dog who had crawled across a floor she could barely walk on to reach a man she had known for less than a day, because something in her recognized something in him that went deeper than language or species. The shared knowledge of what it means to survive something that should have killed you, and to carry the wound forward into every day that follows. Garrett reached down and rested his hand gently on Sheba's head. She did not flinch, did not pull away, just closed her amber eyes and let his hand rest there while the fire burned low and the night pressed against the windows. The next morning, Dot arrived earlier than usual, bringing bread and preserves. Garrett made coffee while Dot sat beside the stove, and the conversation that followed was the longest Garrett had spoken in 2 years on this mountain. Not because Dot asked questions, but because she offered something first. She told him about the day her husband died, not the facts which Garrett already knew in the general way that mountain communities knew each other's tragedies, but the specific, intimate details that she had never shared with anyone outside her family. The flour on her hands when the radio call came. The bread burning in the oven because she forgot to turn it off. The 3 years when the smell of baking bread made her sick. I hated that smell, she said, her gray eyes steady on the fire. For 3 years, I could not bake without feeling like the world was ending again. Then, one morning, I woke up and I put flour on the counter, and I turned on the oven. Not because the pain was gone, but because I understood that continuing to live was not a betrayal of the man who died. It was the only way to deserve what he gave. Garrett said nothing, but his hand, which had been slowly turning the brass ring on his left ring finger, the ring his teammate had worn, and that Garrett had carried since the day he died, stopped moving. The ring rested still against his knuckle for the first time in 2 years. Dot noticed. She did not mention it. She simply poured more coffee and set a plate of cornbread on the table and let the silence hold the weight of what had passed between them. That evening, after Dot had gone and the light was fading from the sky, Garrett stepped onto the porch to check the clearing before nightfall. A habit. A routine. The kind of perimeter check that his body performed whether his mind ordered it or not. He looked down at the porch steps, and his stomach tightened. Boot prints in the mud, large, heavy, pressed deep into the soft earth. Leading from the tree line across the clearing to the base of the porch steps, then stopping, then turning, then leading back into the forest. Someone had walked to his front door during the night, while Garrett was inside having a flashback, while Sheba and the puppies slept beside the fire. Someone had stood on this ground close enough to touch the railing and then turned around and walked away. Garrett crouched beside the prints. Military habit. Reading tracks the way other people read sentences. The boots were large, worn at the heel, heavy tread. The stride was long and unhurried. Whoever made these prints was not running, was not sneaking, was walking with the calm, deliberate pace of someone who wanted to be close enough to see and did not care whether the evidence remained. Sheba appeared in the doorway behind him. The German shepherd looked at the boot prints, then lifted her nose toward the forest, and a low growl rose from deep in her chest. Not loud, not aggressive, but certain. The growl of a dog who recognized a scent she had hoped never to encounter again. She knew who had been here, and the knowledge made her body rigid with a fear that Garrett had not seen since the night he found her bleeding on these same steps. Garrett stood slowly and looked into the darkening forest. The trees stood silent and still. No movement, no sound. But somewhere beyond the first line of pines, along a trail that led eastward toward a valley, where children said they could hear dogs howling at night, someone was watching. Someone who numbered dogs like inventory and set traps in the forest and walked to strangers' porches in the dark with the quiet confidence of a man who believed that everything in these mountains, including the wounded dog beside Garrett's feet, still belonged to him. And that someone now knew exactly where Sheba was. Garrett did not wait for the morning light to strengthen before he moved. He woke in the gray stillness before dawn, with the boot prints outside still fresh in his mind, and the image of Sheba's rigid body and low growl replaying behind his eyes like surveillance footage that his brain refused to stop reviewing. He had spent the night in the chair beside the window with the flashlight on the table and the knife within reach, not sleeping, but not fully awake, either existing in the half state that combat veterans inhabited when the threat level was uncertain and the perimeter was no longer secure. Sheba had remained near the door through the night. Not on her blanket by the stove where warmth and comfort waited, but on the cold floor beside the entrance, her injured leg extended awkwardly, her ears rotating toward every sound that the wind carried across the porch. She was guarding. Not Garrett. The puppies. The instinct to position herself between her offspring and the source of danger had overridden every other need, including rest, including pain. And Garrett had watched her maintain that vigil through the dark hours with a recognition that sat heavy in his chest because he understood what it looked like when a living creature decided that survival was no longer about itself. By 6 o'clock, with the first pale light filtering through the clouds above the ridge, Garrett pulled on his boots and his jacket and stepped onto the porch with the careful deliberation of a man who had spent years entering spaces where everything visible could be a lie and everything hidden could kill you. The boot prints from last night were still there, softened slightly by moisture, but readable. He followed them with his eyes from the porch steps across the clearing to the tree line where they disappeared into the shadows between the pines. Then he followed them with his feet. The trail led eastward along a narrow deer path that wound through dense stands of pine and hemlock, climbing briefly over a rocky outcrop, before descending into a shallow valley where the canopy grew so thick that even the morning light barely reached the forest floor. Garrett moved the way 2 decades of special operations training had taught him to move through unfamiliar terrain. Silent footfalls placed on the outside edges of his boots to minimize noise on the wet ground. Eyes scanning in a continuous pattern, near ground to mid-canopy to far distance and back again, reading the forest the way a translator reads a foreign text, extracting meaning from shapes and shadows and the spaces between sounds. Breathing controlled and shallow. Every sense tuned to the frequency of a forest that should have been full of small morning noises and was instead growing quieter with every 100 meters he traveled deeper into the valley. The quiet was wrong. Not the natural quiet of early morning, when birds had not yet begun their territorial calls, and the forest held its breath between night and day. This was a different kind of silence. The heavy, charged silence of a place that animals had learned to avoid. The kind of silence that Garrett had encountered in villages overseas where the absence of children playing in the streets meant that the people who lived there knew something was coming and had retreated behind closed doors. In those places, silence was not peace. Silence was a warning. After nearly 30 minutes of walking, the first signs of human activity appeared. A set of tire tracks in the soft earth beside the trail, pressed deep by a heavy vehicle, the tread pattern wide and commercial grade. Then a broken branch at shoulder height snapped cleanly, rather than torn by wind, the kind of break a person made when pushing through undergrowth with urgency or in darkness. Then 50 meters further, a crushed aluminum can half buried in leaves beside a flat spot in the earth where something heavy had been set down and picked up again, leaving a rectangular impression the size of a large animal crate. And then the smell reached him. A faint, stale odor of damp wood and rusted metal mixed with something older and more sour that clung to the air beneath the trees like a stain that weather could fade but never fully remove. Garrett had encountered that smell before. In buildings overseas where people had been held for long periods in small spaces without adequate food or water or sanitation, it was the smell of confinement, of bodies pressed together in darkness, of suffering that had accumulated over time until it soaked into the walls and the floor and the earth itself and became as permanent as the soil. The structure appeared behind a line of overgrown shrubs at the base of the valley where the ground leveled out into a small clearing hidden from every direction by terrain and vegetation. A low wooden enclosure built from rough-hewn boards and heavy gauge wire fencing the panels bolted together with industrial hardware to form several connected pens large enough to hold large dogs. The roof had partially collapsed on the eastern side, exposing the interior to rain and debris, and moss crept along the fence posts like green fur growing on bones. The place had been abandoned, but not long ago. Weeks, perhaps. The wood was weathered, but not yet rotten. The wire was rusted, but still taut in places where it had been stretched between posts with the kind of tension that required tools and planning rather than improvisation. Garrett stepped through the gap where a gate had once hung and entered the nearest pen. And stopped. The ground inside the enclosure told the story that the walls and the fencing only hinted at. Short lengths of heavy chain attached to iron rings that had been hammered into the wooden boards at regular intervals along both sides of the pen. 12 rings, 12 chains, 12 positions where 12 animals had been restrained in a space no larger than a 2-car garage, each chain long enough to allow the dog at the end of it to stand and lie down, but not long enough to reach the dog chained beside it. Which meant the animals could not touch each other, could not huddle for warmth during the mountain winters, could not perform the single most basic act of comfort that dogs in distress instinctively sought. They had been kept close enough to hear each other suffering and far enough apart to suffer alone. Whoever had designed this facility understood dogs, and had used that understanding not to care for them, but to control them with maximum efficiency and minimum cost. Empty metal bowls lay overturned in the mud between the pens, the dented commercial-grade bowls used for feeding working animals in volume. Dark stains covered patches of the dirt floor, dried to the color of old rust, but unmistakable in origin. Blood did not disappear from packed earth. It only faded to a shade that most people could ignore if they chose not to look closely. Garrett chose to look closely. The stains were concentrated near the chains in the areas where restrained animals would have lain day after day, their wounds rubbing against the ground, their bodies deteriorating slowly, while someone continued to feed them just enough to keep them alive and productive. And in the nearest pen, bolted to the wall at the height, a large German shepherd's neck would reach, while lying down one chain that told a different story from the others. This chain had not been neatly detached or unclipped from a collar. This chain had been twisted and wrenched and deformed by sustained force applied in one direction over and over and over the metal links, stretched to the edge of their tolerance, and then pushed beyond it until the weakest link had finally surrendered, and the iron ring had torn free from the wooden board in a spray of splinters and corroded metal. The wood around the mounting point was gouged deep, not from a single violent pull, but from hundreds of pulls. Thousands. The relentless, repetitive effort of a creature that had decided the chain would break before she did, and had tested that decision every hour of every day until the universe agreed. Garrett crouched beside the torn chain and lifted it from the mud. The weight of it surprised him. Heavy, far heavier than any reasonable restraint for a domestic animal. This was hardware designed for durability, for permanence, for keeping something contained that wanted desperately to be free. And the diameter of the links matched the scar around Sheba's neck exactly. The iron ring still held fragments of dark fur caught between the metal and the splintered wood. Black saddle coat fur. Her fur. She had been here, chained to this wall, in this darkness, wearing a metal tag that reduced her identity to a product code. And she had fought the chain with a strength that should not have existed in a body as thin and damaged as hers fought it. While pregnant, fought it. While injured, fought it. With the pure, unreasoning determination of a mother who understood that staying meant death for her and for the two lives growing inside her body. And the chain had broken, and she had run. Garrett laid the chain down carefully and stood. He photographed everything with the systematic thoroughness that military training had made reflexive. The chains and the rings and the bowls and the blood stains and the tire tracks and the torn mounting with its embedded fur. Each photograph another piece of a story that was becoming clearer and more disturbing with every frame. Then he drove down the mountain to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dawson Briggs listened to Garrett's account with the measured patience of a man who had spent years separating credible reports from conspiracy theories in a county where both arrived at his desk with equal regularity. But when Garrett placed his phone on the cluttered surface and began scrolling through the photographs, the casual lean of Dawson's broad frame against the back of his chair straightened by degrees until the sheriff was sitting fully upright, his sun-weathered face no longer carrying the hint of skepticism that had been there when Garrett walked in. Within the hour, both men were hiking through the forest toward the enclosure. Dawson moved through the pens in silence for a long time, his boots heavy on the packed dirt, his eyes traveling from the chains to the bowls, to the bloodstains, to the torn mounting where Sheba had finally broken free. He counted the rings aloud. 12. He counted them again to be certain. 12 chains, 12 positions. Space for 12 dogs, held simultaneously in conditions that no living creature should endure. "This is not someone dumping strays," Dawson said, finally crouching beside one of the overturned bowls and turning it over in his hands. This place held a lot of dogs, for a long time, and whoever built it spent real money making sure the animals could not get out. Beneath the bowl, scratched into the packed dirt with what might have been a nail or a piece of heavy wire, were 2 letters. B.R. Blue Ridge Dawson said, "Territory marking. Whoever ran this operation was organized enough to brand their location." On the drive back toward the cabin, Garrett told the sheriff about Truett's drawing. This green truck with the metal cages stacked in the bed. The 3 characters from the license plate the boy had memorized. The direction the truck had been traveling toward the eastern valley where the enclosure now sat empty and rotting in the forest shadows. Dawson made 2 phone calls from the passenger seat, the first to request vehicle registration records matching the partial plate and the truck description, the second to a colleague in Henderson County, asking whether reports of missing dogs had surfaced in the neighboring district over the past year. The answers returned faster than either man expected. 14 separate reports across 3 counties in the past 12 months. Guard dogs vanishing from farms in Henderson County, breeding females disappearing from a kennel operation in McDowell County, litters of young puppies appearing along back roads in Buncombe County with no collars, no microchips, and no identifiable origin. Each incident filed as a minor nuisance complaint, each one too small and too scattered to trigger investigation. But the pattern, once the reports were laid side by side, was as clear as the tire tracks leading to the enclosure in the forest. Someone was collecting dogs across a wide geographic area, concentrating them at hidden facilities in the mountains, and moving them through a distribution pipeline that deliberately crossed county boundaries to avoid creating a detectable pattern in any single jurisdiction. Truitt arrived at the cabin that afternoon with his sketchbook and a determination that had not been there the day before. The boy sat on the porch steps with Ranger sprawled across his lap and Willow pressed against his knee. And when Dawson asked to see the drawing of the truck, Truitt opened his pad to the page without hesitation. The sheriff studied the sketch for a long time, then looked at the boy with an expression that combined professional respect with something gentler. The 3 characters from the license plate, rendered in careful block letters in the margin, matched a vehicle registered to an address in the rural outskirts of Asheville. Then Dawson received the phone call that rearranged everything. His contact at the county assessor's office had run the property records for the parcel of forest land where the enclosure stood. The land did not belong to Wade Crenshaw. It had never belonged to Wade Crenshaw. The parcel was owned by a real estate investment company registered in Asheville, and the company was controlled by a man whose name Dawson recognized immediately and whose face had appeared in the Asheville Citizen-Times more than once in the past year. A man who sat on the county planning board. A man who owned commercial real estate and vacation rental properties and hundreds of acres of undeveloped forest land spread across the Blue Ridge Corridor. A man who attended Chamber of Commerce luncheons and donated to the volunteer fire department and was photographed at charity galas shaking hands with local politicians. A man whose public reputation was so thoroughly constructed that any accusation against him would sound on first hearing like the paranoid invention of someone with a grudge and too much time. Wade Crenshaw was not the operation. Wade Crenshaw was the labor, the hired hand who managed the daily mechanics of confinement feeding and transport. The person who got his boots muddy and his hands dirty and his conscience stained with the kind of cruelty that the man above him would never need to witness directly, because the entire system had been designed to keep the money clean and the suffering hidden deep enough in the forest that it would never reach the surface. Dawson relayed the information to Garrett in the flat, controlled voice that law enforcement officers used when the scope of an investigation expanded beyond what they had prepared for. And as the words settled between them in the quiet of the cabin, Garrett understood with cold clarity why the boot prints outside his door had been left so brazenly. Why the chain had been dropped near his property as a casual message rather than a concealed threat. Wade Crenshaw did not fear being identified because Wade Crenshaw was protected. The man behind the operation had enough money and enough influence to make problems disappear through channels that did not involve violence. Lawyers, political connections, the quiet machinery of respectability deployed to discredit anyone who pointed a finger and asked uncomfortable questions. Garrett was not being treated as a threat. he was being treated as a nuisance, a temporary inconvenience that would be managed or discouraged, or if necessary, overwhelmed by the sheer institutional weight of a system built to protect the people at the top from the consequences of what happened at the bottom. That night, after Dawson left and the cabin grew quiet, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with the metal tag from Sheba's collar under the bright light of the lamp, turning it slowly between his fingers. K9-07-BR. He had read those characters a dozen times since the first night, but now with the day's revelations rewriting everything he thought he understood, the code rearranged itself into a meaning that tightened his jaw and sent a slow, cold anger spreading through his chest. K9 for canine. 07 for the 7th unit in the inventory. BR for the Blue Ridge distribution region. A product tracking code. The same kind of alphanumeric system that warehouses use to identify items on shelves and monitor stock levels across multiple locations. Sheba was not a dog who had been mistreated by one cruel man. Sheba was merchandise. A numbered unit in a commercial pipeline that spanned counties and generated enough revenue to justify the investment in facilities, transportation, and the quiet corruption required to keep it hidden. And if the Blue Ridge facility alone held capacity for 12 dogs, and the operation maintained locations in multiple jurisdictions, then the total number of animals moving through this system was not 12. It was dozens. Perhaps scores, each one wearing a metal tag, each one chained in darkness, each one reduced from a living creature with a name and a nature and a capacity for loyalty and love into a line item on someone's balance sheet. Sheba had been K9-07, the 7th, which meant 6 had come before her, and 5 had come after. And those were only the ones assigned to this single facility. The phone rang. Dawson's name on the screen. Garrett answered. "We found a second location." Dawson's voice was steady but stripped of the professional distance that usually characterized his tone. "A warehouse on a parcel south of the Eastern Ridge. Same ownership chain as the forest enclosure. Same company. Same man at the top. We went in with animal control an hour ago." The sheriff paused. The pause lasted long enough that Garrett could hear the man breathing on the other end of the line, and in that breath was the particular weight of someone who had seen something that would not leave his memory quickly or easily. There are dogs inside Garrett, alive and dead. The ones still breathing are in bad shape, dehydrated, underfed, some with injuries that look like they have been there for weeks without treatment. And every single one of them is wearing a metal tag with the same coding system as the one on your dog's collar. Garrett looked across the room at Sheba. The German Shepherd lay on the blanket near the stove with Ranger pressed against her chest and Willow curled in the space between her belly and her injured hind leg. The firelight moved across her black saddle coat in slow, warm waves and caught the dull glint of the metal tag still hanging from the cracked leather collar around her scarred neck. K9-07-BR, the 7th dog. One number in a system that had consumed how many others? Sheba lifted her head and met his eyes across the room. Her amber gaze was steady, patient, the gaze of a creature who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to her, and who carried that survival not as triumph, but as a quiet fact embedded in her bones, the way the limp in her hind leg would remain embedded in her stride long after the wound itself had healed. 12 chains in the forest pen. A warehouse full of tagged dogs, some alive, and some beyond saving. A hired hand named Wade Crenshaw, who walked to strangers' porches in the dark because his employer was powerful enough to make consequences optional. And behind it all, a man in a suit who sat on a county planning board and shook hands at charity events, while the money generated by caged and suffering animals flowed quietly into accounts that bore his name. This was not one bad person doing cruel things in the woods. This was a system. Organized, funded, protected by the kind of respectability that turned accusations into absurdities and transformed whistleblowers into nuisances. And Garrett Hale, a retired Navy SEAL who had come to these mountains to vanish from the world and had succeeded at vanishing so completely that he had nearly disappeared from himself, was now standing directly in the path of that system with a wounded dog at his feet, and a choice taking shape in his mind that he could not yet see clearly, but could feel approaching with the same certainty that a soldier feels when the silence before contact gives way to the first distant crack of a rifle. Sheba held his gaze for another moment, then lowered her head and rested it against Willow's back, her amber eyes closing slowly. The trust in that gesture was so complete and so quiet that it barely made a sound. But Garrett heard it. And the sound it made was the sound of a door opening inside him that he had believed was sealed shut forever. The door that led back to the world, back to the fight, back to the version of himself that he had buried beneath 2 years of silence and solitude and the steady repetition of the lie that isolation was the same thing as peace. It was not peace. It had never been peace. It had been hiding, and the time for hiding was almost over. The days that followed the discovery of the warehouse moved with a momentum that Garrett could feel building in his chest, the way a soldier feels the acceleration of events in the hours before a mission launches. Each morning brought new information from Dawson that widened the fractures in the operation hiding in the mountains, and each evening brought new evidence that the people behind that operation understood exactly how close those fractures were to breaking open and were no longer content to leave rusted bowls on porches and boot prints in the mud. Garrett drove to the warehouse site with Dawson on the morning after the phone call. The corrugated metal building sat in a clearing cut from the forest on the southern slope of the eastern ridge, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through trees so dense the structure was invisible from any public road or hiking trail. The smell reached Garrett before he crossed the threshold. Ammonia and decay, and the particular sour sweetness of living bodies confined in spaces too small for too long, without adequate food or water or light. He had encountered that smell before, in buildings overseas where the contents were human rather than animal. The similarity made his stomach clench with a recognition he did not want to feel. Inside rows of stacked wire crates lined both walls bolted to metal frames that held them 4 high from floor to ceiling. Dawson's animal control team had already begun documenting and removing the surviving dogs. 7 were still alive, each in varying stages of malnutrition and untreated injury, each wearing a metal tag with the same K9 coding system that hung from Sheba's collar. 3 had not survived. Their crates were marked with yellow tape and left for the veterinary examiner arriving later that morning. The sound inside the building was worse than the smell. Not barking. Dogs kept in these conditions long enough eventually stopped barking because barking required energy and hope, and both had been systematically stripped from the animals in this place. What remained was a low, continuous whimpering that rose and fell like breathing a frequency of misery, sustained at the minimum effort required to express that something alive still existed inside each crate. Garrett stood in the doorway and looked at the rows of tagged dogs and the yellow tape, and the stacked crates reaching toward the ceiling, and he understood with a clarity that settled into his bones like cold water that Sheba had been in a place exactly like this before she was transferred to the forest facility for breeding, crated, coated, stored. And when the breeding was done and the puppies born, she would have been returned to a crate or a chain or discarded entirely, because in a system that measured value in product output, a dog that could no longer produce was inventory that had expired. He returned to the cabin that afternoon, carrying the weight of what he had seen like a stone lodged beneath his ribs. Sheba was waiting on the porch. She had dragged herself to the doorway while he was gone, her injured leg trailing behind her on the floorboards, and she sat with her ears forward and her amber eyes fixed on the gravel road below, as if she had been tracking the sound of his truck from the moment it appeared on the ridge. Ranger and Willow tumbled around her feet, oblivious to anything except their own small world of play. But Sheba did not move from her position until Garrett climbed the steps and crouched beside her. Then she pressed her nose against his hand and exhaled one long breath, and the gesture carried a fear that Garrett recognized instantly. She had been afraid he would not come back. That evening, the threats began arriving at the cabin with a frequency and precision that told Garrett the operation's response had shifted from intimidation to preparation. At dusk, he found a rusted metal feeding bowl placed in the center of the bottom porch step, the same commercial grade bowl he had photographed in the forest enclosure and the warehouse, positioned with deliberate care, not discarded, delivered. A message that required no translation. I can reach your door anytime I want. The next morning was worse. Garrett walked his perimeter the way he had walked perimeters around forward operating bases in Afghanistan, scanning the ground with an attention to detail that most civilians would consider obsessive, but that 20 years of combat had made as involuntary as blinking. 30 meters south of the cabin, on the narrow trail connecting the clearing to the main gravel road, his boots stopped 6 inches short of a patch of disturbed earth covered by scattered leaves. He crouched and brushed the leaves aside with a long stick. His blood went cold. A steel jaw trap. Open. Set. Buried just below the surface with a thin layer of dirt arranged over the trigger plate. The same type of trap that had destroyed Sheba's hind leg, positioned on the trail that Garrett walked every morning, the trail Sheba used for her recovery walks, the trail Truitt followed when he came up from the road below. Garrett triggered the trap with the stick. The jaws snapped shut with a crack that split the morning silence like a rifle shot. He searched the rest of the perimeter, found 2 more. One near the woodpile where he split logs each afternoon. One at the edge of the gravel road where grass met gravel. Both set. Both concealed. Both placed in locations that corresponded precisely to the daily patterns of life at the cabin. This was not a warning. This was an ambush laid by someone who had studied how Garrett and the dogs and the boy moved through their days and had turned that knowledge into a minefield. Not traps for animals. Traps for a family. Garrett collected all 3, sealed them in a tarp, and called Dawson. The sheriff arrived within the hour, examined the traps, and took them as evidence with an expression on his sun-weathered face that had lost every trace of the professional detachment he normally maintained. Someone had placed devices capable of shattering bone along pathways used by an 11-year-old boy and a recovering dog. The calculation required to do that was not the product of rage or impulse. It was the product of a mind that viewed other living things as obstacles to be removed. Truitt arrived that afternoon. And what the boy said made the stone beneath Garrett's ribs grow heavier. The green truck was at my school today. Truett's voice was quiet, his hands tight on the sketchbook in his lap, his green eyes carrying a weight that did not belong on the face of a child. It was parked on the road by the playground before first bell, just sitting there. Nobody got out. It left before classes started. The boy looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at the boy. Neither spoke for a long moment because the meaning of what Truett had described required no elaboration. Wade Crenshaw or someone working for him had positioned a vehicle outside a school where a child connected to Garrett could see it. The truck had not done anything. It did not need to do anything. Its presence was the message. We know who matters to you. We know where to find them. That night, after Truett had gone home and Garrett had called Dot to warn her to lock her doors and keep her phone within reach, he sat alone in the cabin with the fire burning low and the 3 disarmed traps laid out on the table beside the feeding bowl and the metal tag from Sheba's collar. The evidence arranged before him like an exhibit in a trial that had not yet begun. The flashback came without warning. One moment he was staring at the traps. The next the cabin was gone, and the smell had changed from wood smoke to copper and dust and the particular metallic taste that hung in the air after an explosion tore through a confined space. He was not in the alley this time. He was past the alley, past the drag, past the 15 meters he had already relived 1,000 times in the chair beside the stove on nights when sleep refused to come. This time, the flashback dropped him into the moment after the moment he never allowed himself to reach. Because reaching it meant feeling the thing he had spent 2 years on this mountain learning not to feel. He was kneeling in the dust behind the concrete wall with his teammate in his arms, and the dust-off was 3 minutes out, and the radio was screaming coordinates, and Garrett's hands were pressing against the wound in the man's abdomen, but the blood was coming through his fingers faster than pressure could hold it, and the heat of it was obscene against the cold that was spreading through the body beneath his hands. His teammate's eyes were open, focused, not on the sky or the wall or the chaos around them, but on Garrett's face, with the terrible clarity of a man who understood exactly what was happening to him and had decided to spend his last conscious seconds looking at the person he trusted most. His teammate's hand rose from the dirt and gripped Garrett's wrist. Not hard. There was no strength left for hard. Just enough pressure to say, I am still here. Just enough to hold on. Then the grip loosened. The fingers slid from Garrett's wrist and fell to the ground, and the eyes that had been focused on his face softened into something distant and unreachable, and the mouth formed words that Garrett heard not through his ears, but through his bones. Not your fault. But tonight, the flashback mutated. The face beneath his hands shifted. The dust cleared, and the face looking up from the ground was not his teammate. It was Truett, 11 years old. Sandy brown hair matted with dust. Green eyes dimming, wearing his dead father's denim jacket soaked with blood that Garrett's hands could not stop. The face shifted again. Dot. Silver hair spread in the dirt. Gray eyes that had seen so much of life now seeing the end of it. Again. Sheba. On the porch. In the rain. 2 puppies pressed against her belly. The metal tag glinting in the flashlight. And the blood. The blood that Garrett could not stop no matter how fast he moved or how hard he pressed, because 15 meters was always 15 meters too many, and he was always too late, and the people he tried to protect always ended up on the ground, while a voice he could not silence told him a lie disguised as forgiveness. his hands locked on the chair arms with enough force to make the wood groan. Breathing fractured. Vision collapsed. Sweat soaked his collar. The room shrank to a tunnel, with the faces at the far end cycling through their rotation of accusation and absolution, while the voice repeated its impossible claim on an endless loop. Not your fault, but it would be. If he stayed here, and Wade Crenshaw, or the man above him, decided to escalate from traps to something worse. The people who would pay the price were not Garrett. They were Truett and Dot and Sheba and two puppies who had not asked for any of this. Garrett had brought danger to their doorstep by choosing to open his door on a stormy night and refusing to look away from what he found. The logical solution, the safe solution, the solution that had governed every major decision since the alley in Helmand was to remove himself, disappear, drive the truck down the mountain, and keep driving until the gravel road became asphalt and the mountains became flatland, and the people behind him were far enough away that his proximity could no longer endanger them. Run. The way he had always run. Not from cowardice, but from the unbearable mathematics of loss. Remove the variable that attracted danger, and the equation balanced itself. Leave, and they would be safe. Stay, and they would bleed. The calculation was simple. The calculation had always been simple, and Garrett was halfway out of the chair, his body already committing to the motion before his mind had finished approving it, when something cold and wet pressed against the back of his hand. Sheba. Not crawling this time. Standing. She had risen from the blanket by the stove on 3 legs and crossed the room upright, her injured hind leg hovering above the floor, but her body steady her movement, deliberate, carrying none of the desperate fragility of the night weeks ago when she had dragged herself across the boards to press her nose against his hand for the first time. That had been a wounded animal reaching toward a stranger. This was something different. This was a dog who had healed enough to walk crossing a room because she chose to positioning herself beside his chair and lowering her chin onto his knee with a weight and a warmth that pressed through the fabric of his trousers and settled against his skin like a hand placed on a shoulder by someone who had earned the right to touch. The weight of her head on his leg was not heavy. 60 pounds of dog resting a fraction of herself against a fraction of him. But it was the most deliberate physical contact Sheba had ever initiated, and the meaning of it broke through the flashback the way a stone breaks through the surface of frozen water. Garrett looked down. Sheba looked up. And what he saw in her amber eyes was not the cautious assessment of their early days together, when every glance carried the calculation of an animal deciding whether to trust or to flee. What he saw now was certainty, the settled, unshakable certainty of a creature who had made her decision about this man and was no longer willing to watch him destroy himself without objection. He saw refusal. This dog had been chained to a wall in a dark pen, tagged with an inventory number, trapped in steel jaws that shattered her leg. She had been starved and confined and bred and used until the system that owned her had extracted everything it wanted and left her with nothing except 2 lives growing inside a body that was already failing. She had every reason in the world to lie down in the forest on the night of the storm and let the rain and the cold finish what the chain and the trap had started. Every reason to surrender. Every justification for giving up that any creature could ask for. And she had refused. She had broken her chain through sheer relentless force. She had dragged herself and her unborn puppies through miles of mountain forest in a storm that bent trees and flooded trails. She had found a stranger's porch and crawled up the steps on 3 legs and scratched at a door that might never have opened, because something inside her, something that existed below instinct and beyond reason in the place where life itself decided whether to continue or to stop, had made a choice. Not to calculate odds, not to weigh risks, not to run the mathematics of survival and conclude that the numbers were unfavorable. Simply to move forward. Simply to try. Simply to refuse the darkness one more time and see what happened next. Garrett stared at the dog who had done all of that, and who now stood beside his chair on a leg that would never fully heal, pressing her nose against the hand of a man who was about to run away from the first thing that had mattered to him in 2 years. "You did not run," he said. The words came out rough and broken, scraped from somewhere below his throat, barely louder than the dying fire. "You did not run." He unclenched his hands, placed his palm on Sheba's head, felt the warmth of her skull and the slow rhythm of her breathing, and the solidity of a creature who was here now, present, alive, and not going anywhere. So I am not going to run either. Morning arrived with the clarity that sometimes followed a night of crisis, when the mind had burned through its worst fears and emerged on the other side into a stillness that was not peace exactly, but was close enough to work with. Garrett called Dawson at 7. "We finish this." His voice carried a quality that the sheriff had not heard before. Not anger, not desperation. The focused calm of a man who had identified his mission and locked onto it with the precision that had once made him reliable in places where hesitation meant body bags. "I am at your office in 1 hour. The investigation shifted into its final phase with a speed and efficiency that reflected the combined force of a SEAL-trained operator, a determined county sheriff, and a community that had decided it was no longer willing to look away. Garrett applied his military training to the problem the way a precision instrument is applied to a lock. He mapped Wade Crenshaw's movements through the tire tracks on the forest trails and identified a repeating pattern. Tuesdays and Fridays. The route ran from the abandoned enclosure southeast to the warehouse, then west to a junction near the county line where a secondary vehicle waited. A distribution circuit. Predictable. Documented. Vulnerable. Dot became the intelligence network that no one suspected. She moved through the stores and churches and gathering places of the mountain community with the unhurried ease of a woman who had been buying apples and folding church supper napkins in these same places for 40 years, and no one considered the possibility that she was listening with the systematic attention of an operative collecting fragments for a mosaic. A neighbor on Route 9 had seen the green truck parked behind a hay barn after dark. A farmer's wife mentioned her husband's Rottweiler vanishing from its kennel 3 weeks prior. A woman at the hardware store recalled selling heavy chain and commercial padlocks to a man in a canvas jacket who paid cash and never smiled. Each fragment traveled up the mountain to Garrett's table alongside Dot's cornbread, and each fragment found its place in the picture that was now nearly complete. Truitt provided the piece that only a child's memory could supply. His partial license plate had already been matched to a vehicle in the system, but the boy also remembered the schedule, the same 2 days each week, the same direction at the fork, the same time of day. Confirmation of the distribution pattern that Garrett had mapped from the ground. The boy was afraid. Garrett could see it in the tightness of his hands on the sketchbook and the way his green eyes moved toward the tree line when shadows lengthened. But Truitt came to the cabin every afternoon, with Ranger bounding toward him and Willow pressing against his leg. And he offered what he knew with the steady, quiet courage of a child who understood that silence in the presence of cruelty was its own kind of betrayal. Then Sheba gave them the evidence that no human investigation could have found. Garrett had been walking her along the forest trails for rehabilitation, supporting her weight when the injured leg faltered, letting her set the pace. One afternoon, at the junction where the deer path split toward the eastern valley, Sheba stopped. Her nose lifted, her ears locked forward, and instead of continuing the route Garrett had planned, she turned south and pulled. He followed, through old-growth hemlocks, past a dry creek bed, into a depression in the terrain, invisible from the main trail, accessible only through a gap between two massive boulders. Behind the boulders, beneath a weighted tarp, Garrett found what Sheba had led him to: collapsible wire crates folded flat and bundled, coils of heavy chain, and a waterproof container holding documents, transport manifests listing delivery addresses in 3 states, phone numbers, financial records showing cash payments routed through accounts that connected the field operation to the legitimate business structure above it. Sheba had remembered, not the pain, not the fear, the routes, the stops, the places where the tools of her imprisonment had been stored. And she had brought Garrett to this cache with the deliberate purpose of a witness leading an investigator to the evidence that would make a case. Because Sheba was not merely a victim of this system, she was its living memory. And her memory had just become the most powerful weapon in Garrett's hands. He delivered the documents to Dawson that evening. The sheriff spread the manifests across his desk and studied them with an intensity that matched Garrett's own. Names connected to routes, connected to dates, connected to dollar amounts. A trail that led from the forest pens through the warehouse across state lines to buyers in Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia. Dawson called the State Bureau of Investigation. Within 48 hours, a joint task force had assembled. Search warrants were drafted for every property in the ownership chain. Arrest warrants were prepared for Wade Crenshaw and the man whose name sat at the top of the corporate structure. The night before the warrants were to be served, Garrett stood on the porch, scanning the clearing. Sheba stood beside him, weight on 3 legs, ears forward, amber eyes on the tree line. Thunder murmured along the western ridge. Another storm was building. Then Sheba barked. Not the low growl he had grown accustomed to. A full explosive bark that cracked across the clearing and echoed down the slope. Then another. And another. Each one aimed at a fixed point in the darkness, at the forest edge. 2 figures stood at the tree line. Wade Crenshaw in his canvas jacket, rain beginning to darken the fabric. And beside him, half concealed by the nearest pine trunk, a second figure, taller, thinner, standing with the rigid posture of someone unaccustomed to the woods and uncomfortable being seen. Neither man stepped forward. Neither spoke. They stood at the boundary between forest and clearing and looked at the cabin where the porch light illuminated Garrett and Sheba standing side by side in the first drops of rain. The message was silence itself. We know what tomorrow brings. We know where you are, and we have not decided yet how this ends. Garrett looked back at them across the darkening ground. Sheba's barking subsided into a sustained growl that Garrett could feel vibrating through the porch boards beneath his boots. The rain intensified. The figures held their position for another 10 seconds. Then they turned and disappeared into the forest, and the night closed around the cabin. Garrett remained on the porch. The rain hammered the tin roof with the same percussion that had accompanied every turning point since the night Sheba arrived. He looked at the dog beside him. She looked back, her amber eyes steady in the stormlight, unafraid. Not because the danger was not real, but because she had already survived worse and had decided that fear was no longer a sufficient reason to retreat. Tomorrow, the warrants would be served. Tomorrow, the chains that held this system together would be tested the way Sheba had tested the chain that held her to the wall. And one way or another, something was going to break. Garrett reached down and rested his hand on Sheba's head. The storm rolled across the ridge above them, shaking the trees, filling the valley with sound and fury. But on the porch of the small cabin, in the space between a man and a dog who had both learned that the hardest battle was not the one fought against enemies, but the one fought against the desire to stop fighting altogether, there was stillness. And in that stillness, there was resolve. The storm broke over the Appalachian Ridge with the full weight of a mountain winter arriving weeks ahead of schedule. Rain hammered the forest in sheets so dense the trees beyond the clearing vanished into a wall of gray water, and wind drove down the slope hard enough to bend the tall pines at angles that made the wood groan. The gravel road had become a rushing channel of brown water, and the last daylight had been swallowed by clouds so low they seemed to press directly onto the ridgeline, pushing darkness down onto the mountain like a hand closing over a flame. Inside the cabin, Garrett had made his preparations, with the calm of a man who had spent 20 years planning operations that began in darkness. Dot sat in the chair beside the stove with her coat buttoned and her phone on the armrest, her gray eyes watching the front door with the stillness of a woman who had lived through enough emergencies to recognize the quality of silence that preceded trouble. She had refused to leave. "I buried a husband who died running into a burning building," she had said. "I am not sitting in my kitchen wondering what is happening up here while you stand on this porch alone." Truett sat on the floor with Ranger across his lap and Willow against his hip, both puppies sensing the charged atmosphere and burrowing closer to the boy. His thin arms wrapped around both dogs with a tightness he did not realize he was exerting. His green eyes were wide and fixed on the door, his jaw set in the expression children develop when they are trying to match the courage of the adults around them. His father's denim jacket hung from his narrow shoulders, like a shield inherited from a man who could no longer carry it. Sheba lay near the door, not on her blanket by the stove. On the cold floor beside the entrance, her body positioned between the threshold and the interior, where the puppies and the boy and the old woman sat in amber light. Her injured leg extended to the side, her head raised her ears, scanning the storm. She had held this position for 2 hours. Garrett did not try to move her because he understood the decision. He had made it himself 1,000 times in places where the door was the last barrier between the people behind you and whatever was coming through the dark. Dawson was en route with warrants signed and state investigators staging at the county line. But the storm had turned the road treacherous, and his last transmission estimated 20 minutes. In the language of combat, 20 minutes was an eternity. The change in Sheba reached Garrett before any sound from outside, a quickening of her breath that shifted the rhythm of the room. Then the growl rising from deep in her chest with the authority of a body that recognized the approaching scent before the mind could process it. Through the rain-streaked window, the porch light cast a weak circle across the steps. At its edge, a figure materialized from the storm darkness. moving with purpose, with urgency. Wade Crenshaw crossed the clearing in long, hard strides, rain streaming from his cap. His face had shed every trace of casual menace. This was a man operating under instructions from someone who did not tolerate failure. The dog and the evidence needed to vanish before sunrise, and a storm with a 20-minute gap provided the only window. He was not alone. A second figure emerged from the opposite side, rounding the back of the cabin with the lateral approach of someone who understood that 2 entry points divided a defender's attention. Taller than Wade, moving with less certainty but enough determination. Something metallic glinted in his right hand. Garrett turned from the window. His voice was quiet. Dot. Take Truett and the puppies behind the stove. Stay low. Do not open any door for anyone except me or Dawson. Dot moved with speed that defied her age, guiding Truett to the far wall, scooping Willow with her free hand. Ranger squirmed in the boy's arms. The puppies whimpered. Sheba had risen. 3 legs. Injured leg trembling above the floor. Ears flat. Lips drawn from teeth. The growl broke the surface and became something that filled the cabin with its raw and absolute authority, a sound that drew a line across the floorboards and dared anything on the other side to cross it. Whatever came through that door would come through her first. Garrett opened the front door and stepped into the rain. Wade stood at the base of the steps close enough that the light caught every detail. The expression of a man who feared the person above him more than the person in front. That dog is evidence. Wade said, his voice pitched above the storm, but cracking at the edges in a way it never had during his previous visits. The voice of a man operating on instructions he could not refuse from a person he could not disappoint. Evidence disappears in these mountains. You know that. Garrett filled the doorway. He did not speak. His steel blue eyes settled on Wade's face with the absolute stillness of a man who had said everything he intended to say to this person weeks ago on this same porch, and saw no reason to repeat himself. The silence that poured out of the cabin doorway and into the storm was heavier than any words Garrett could have chosen, because it carried the full weight of a decision already made, a line already drawn, a man who had stopped running and was now simply standing in the place he had chosen to defend. Wade held Garrett's gaze for 3 seconds. Then his eyes dropped to Sheba's shadow moving behind Garrett's legs, and whatever he saw there pushed him past the boundary of his own hesitation. He put his boot on the bottom step, and Sheba came through the door like something unleashed. The German shepherd launched herself with explosive force that should have been impossible from a body carrying the damage hers carried. She cleared the distance in a single stride and planted herself in front of Wade with teeth bared and a bark so loud and savage it echoed off the trees and the roof and rolled down the mountainside like a second kind of thunder. This was the full fury of a mother defending her children, a creature chained and starved and trapped who had endured it all in silence, because silence was survival in captivity. But captivity was over, and silence was finished. Wade stumbled off the step, knee buckling on wet ground face inches from Sheba's teeth. Genuine fear replaced calculation in his eyes for the first time. Then the back door crashed inward. Splintering wood. Dot's voice sharp and commanding. Truett shouting. Puppies yelping. Garrett vaulted the railing and hit the ground sprinting. 3 strides around the corner into near total darkness. The second man was halfway through the forced back door. Garrett's momentum drove them both through the frame onto the storage room floor. They crashed into stacked firewood that collapsed around them. The man was taller but lighter, his movements desperate and uncoordinated against someone trained to finish confrontations in seconds. 4 seconds. Left hand on collar, pulling down. Right forearm across the back, rotating the body face down. Knee on spine. Wrists locked behind. Close quarters technique encoded so deep it required no thought and permitted no resistance. The man went still. Not from exhaustion, but from the sudden understanding that the efficiency of what had happened made further struggle pointless. Sheba's barking continued from the front in sustained salvos. Dot's voice from the main room. "We are fine. The boy is safe." And from outside, climbing the mountain road through rain and wind and barking the sound Garrett had been counting toward. Sirens. Dawson's truck swung into the clearing. Headlights slashed through rain and caught Wade on his knees at the porch steps where Sheba still held position, body between the man and the door, bark undiminished, injured leg trembling but refusing to fold. Wade was face down in the mud with his wrists cuffed in less than a minute. The bravado that had carried him to this porch on 3 separate occasions dissolved into the wet, silent submission of a man who understood, with the sudden clarity that only handcuffs could provide, that the architecture of protection above him, the money and the connections and the respectability of the man who signed his paychecks, could not reach down to this muddy clearing on this particular night to prevent what was happening. The second man was walked from the storage room to a patrol car with the blank expression of someone whose participation in another man's scheme had just become the defining catastrophe of his life. The clearing filled with flashing lights and the crackle of radio traffic, and the organized, purposeful movement of a law enforcement operation reaching its conclusion. Through all of it, Sheba held her position on the porch. She did not relax her stance. She did not lower her head. She did not retreat a single inch from the spot she had claimed when she launched herself through the cabin door into the teeth of the storm and the face of the man who had chained her. She stood there on 3 trembling legs, with her injured limb hovering above the wet boards, and her eyes tracking every movement in the clearing until the last patrol car received its passenger and the last set of taillights disappeared down the gravel road, and the clearing returned to the sound of rain and wind and the slow dripping of water from the porch eaves. Only then did the tension leave her body. It departed in a slow, visible wave that traveled from her rigid shoulders through her shaking legs to her paws, her head lowered, her muscles unlocked, and her injured hind leg, which had supported her weight through 15 minutes of sustained fury, fueled by nothing except the primal refusal of a mother to yield ground while her children were behind her, finally acknowledged the reality of its own damage. She sank onto the porch boards in a slow, controlled descent that carried more dignity in its collapse than most creatures managed in their strongest moments. Garrett knelt beside her in the rain and placed his hand on her head. Sheba leaned into his palm and closed her amber eyes, and the breath she released was long and deep and shuddering, carrying with it the accumulated weight of vigilance and fear and the fierce, desperate readiness that had held her upright through the worst night of her second life. The warrants were served at dawn. Every property in the ownership chain was searched simultaneously. The man at the top was arrested at his home in Asheville's wealthiest neighborhood, still in the clothes he had slept in his face, carrying the blank incomprehension of someone who believed money formed an impenetrable barrier between himself and accountability. The evidence dismantled that barrier piece by piece. photographs of 12 chains on a wall, financial documents found beneath a tarp behind 2 boulders, led to by a dog who remembered the roots of the operation that had imprisoned her. Transport manifests connecting addresses across 3 states. Testimony from a sheriff who counted the chains. A sketch drawn by an 11-year-old boy who remembered 3 license plate characters because the careful observation he developed during years of grief had made him the kind of witness investigators spent careers hoping to find. And an old woman who carried truth up a mountain alongside cornbread. Garrett testified. He stood in a room full of strangers and lawyers and recording equipment and spoke the truth about what he had found on his porch, and in the forest, and in the warehouse, and behind the boulders. He answered questions that required him to describe the condition of animals that would stay in his memory forever, and the threats that had been made against people he had come to love. He allowed himself to be seen and recorded and examined in a room where the lights were bright and there was nowhere to hide and no shadows to disappear into. And standing in that room after 2 years of deliberate invisibility on a mountain required a kind of courage fundamentally different from anything he had exercised in 20 years of military service. In combat, the enemy was visible and the mission was defined and the rules permitted action from behind cover. In the courtroom, the mission was truth, and the method was exposure. And the requirement was that he remain in open ground and let the world see him damage and scars, and all without retreating. He did it anyway, because a dog who weighed 60 pounds and walked on 3 legs had demonstrated that breaking free did not always mean fighting your way out. Sometimes it meant standing still and letting the light reach the places you had spent years keeping hidden. Spring arrived on the ridge with the slow patience mountain seasons always carried. Frost retreated from the valleys first, then the slopes, then the peaks, where the last stubborn patches of ice lingered in the shadows between boulders, before finally surrendering to the warming air. The trees above Garrett's cabin filled with pale green leaves that filtered the strengthening sunlight into long, warm shafts across the clearing, and wildflowers pushed through the damp soil along the gravel road in patches of yellow and white that looked from a distance like small celebrations scattered across the mountainside. The cabin itself remained the same weathered structure perched among the pines, its tin roof still catching the morning light, the way it had for decades, its porch still creaking beneath familiar footsteps. But the atmosphere surrounding it had transformed so completely that a person driving up the gravel road for the first time would never have guessed this was a place where a man had once come to disappear from the world. Sheba greeted every arrival. Her coat had regained its health, the black saddle markings rich over a body that had filled back toward the muscular frame of a working-line shepherd. The limp remained and always would. A permanent hitch in her stride, the body's memory of a steel trap in a dark forest. But the limp had transformed. It no longer resembled weakness. It resembled testimony. Evidence that a creature could endure the worst the world delivered and still choose each morning to stand and walk into sunlight. Ranger and Willow had grown into young dogs whose personalities filled the clearing. Ranger charged through the grass with the reckless confidence of an adolescent discovering the world's size. Willow moved in his wake with quieter intelligence, watching and choosing her moments with a patience that consistently outperformed her brother's enthusiasm. Truett arrived every afternoon, sketchbook under his arm, his father's jacket fitting better each month. The drawings had changed. No longer solitary mountain landscapes. Now the pages held dogs, playing dogs, sleeping dogs, running beside a boy whose expression had shifted from the careful neutrality of grief to something unmistakably like happiness returning. Dot came most days with her basket, and the kitchen that once held nothing but a kettle and a pan now carried the scent of bread and preserves, and the particular warmth that filled rooms where people gathered often enough to leave their presence embedded in the walls. On a morning in late April, when the clearing was bright with wildflowers, and the air carried the sweet green scent of new growth, Garrett and Truett carried a long wooden plank down to the edge of the gravel road where the clearing opened toward the slope below. Garrett had spent the previous afternoon carving letters into the wood with his knife, each cut deliberate and deep, executed with the focused precision of a man who understood that the thing he was building had been taking shape inside his life for months before the blade ever touched the grain. Truett sanded the surface until the wood shone golden beneath the morning sun, his thin hands working the sandpaper with a care that suggested the boy understood the significance of what they were making, even though neither of them had discussed it directly. They set the post in the earth and hammered it solid and stepped back together to read the words carved across the plank in letters visible from the bend in the road below. Blue Ridge Haven. The name came from Truett on a quiet evening beside the stove. Any place where lost dogs find safety deserves a name that sounds like a home instead of a hiding place. Garrett said nothing then, but the words stayed the way certain truth stayed when spoken by someone too young to know their importance and too honest to say anything else. That evening, Garrett found a drawing on the kitchen table. Pencil on paper, 5 figures before a cabin under a sky full of light. A broad-shouldered man, a silver-haired woman, a thin boy in an oversized jacket, 3 dogs arranged among them with the proximity of creatures who belonged exactly where they stood. Beneath the image in block letters, one word: family. Garrett studied it for a long time. The lines were careful and precise, the kind of drawing that a boy made when the subject mattered enough to justify starting over if the pencil slipped. Then he took a nail from the jar on the shelf and hung the paper on the wall beside the stove in the place where firelight would catch it every evening when the cabin was warm and the people who filled it were gathered in the positions they had chosen for themselves. Dot saw it when she arrived an hour later. She looked at the drawing, looked at Garrett. Her gray eyes shone with moisture she did not try to explain or wipe away. She placed a jar of blackberry preserves on the shelf and turned away without speaking, and the quiet between them held more than any sentence could have carried. That night, with the last light fading behind the western ridge, Dot paused in the doorway and looked at Garrett on the porch with Sheba's head on his knee. "You know," she said quietly, "I believe sometimes the Lord does not send miracles through fire or lightning, or a voice that shakes the ground. Sometimes he sends them through a sound so small you could miss it. A scratching on a porch in the dark, a cry the storm almost swallows. And he waits. He waits to see if we will hear it. He waits to see if we will open the door." Garrett did not answer with words. He rested his hand on Sheba's head and felt warmth and heartbeat and the deep rhythm of a creature resting where rest was finally safe. The dog who broke her chain and crawled through a storm with 2 lives inside her body and scratched at a door that might never have opened. The door Garrett almost left shut because shutting doors was all he had done for 2 years. The lights of Asheville appeared in the valley as darkness filled the spaces between the mountains. Golden points scattered like fallen stars. Garrett watched them the way he had 100 times. But tonight, the watching was different. He was no longer measuring distance between himself and a world he had abandoned. He was part of it now, connected, held in place not by isolation but by every choice he had made since the night he knelt beside a dying dog and decided her life was worth saving. Behind him, the cabin glowed. Through the window came Dot's humming something old and nameless that carried the melody of a woman who had made peace with loss and moved through the world, understanding that peace was not the absence of pain, but the presence of something worth protecting. In the clearing, Truett's laughter rose bright as Ranger knocked him flat, and Willow piled on a tangle of paws and denim and joy that echoed off the trees and carried over the ridge into the evening air. Sheba settled her head more firmly against Garrett's knee. Her amber eyes opened briefly, catching the last valley light, then closed. The scar around her neck was still there beneath the fur. The limp would be there tomorrow and every tomorrow after. But the dog who carried those marks was not defined by them, just as the man whose hand rested on her head was not defined by the ring he wore or the nightmares that still found him before dawn. They were defined by what they had chosen: to stay, to heal, to open a door when opening it was harder than keeping it shut, to build something in a world that had given them both abundant reasons to believe nothing they built would last. The sign at the road stood solid against the darkening sky. Blue Ridge Haven. Not a hiding place, a home. Garrett closed his eyes. The porch was solid beneath him. The dog was warm against his leg. The laughter of a boy and the humming of an old woman filled the air like a song he had not known he needed until he heard it. For the first time in longer than memory reached, the silence inside his chest did not feel like emptiness. It felt like peace. And peace, Garrett was learning, was not something you found by running far enough or hiding long enough. Peace was what happened when you stopped running. When you opened the door, when you let a broken creature in from the storm and discovered in the act of saving something smaller and weaker than yourself that the thing being saved was also you. The stars came out above the mountains. The fire crackled inside the cabin. And on the porch of a small weathered house, halfway up the Appalachian Ridge, a man and a dog who had both survived things that should have ended them sat together in the dark and breathed the same mountain air and felt for the first time, and perhaps for always, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be.